This episode is about one of the most notorious multiple murder cases from the 1930s. One of the reasons that it was so renowned was the innovative forensic techniques that were used in solving a complex case that were way ahead of their time. It was a painstaking investigation to find out who the victims were and where the crime took place, and to track down the culprit. This is Vintage Murders and the mystery of the bodies under the bridge. It all begins on the 21st of March 1899 with the birth of Bakhtiar Hakim to a family of Indian French origin in Bombay. He was a highly intelligent child and received a thorough education. By his teenage years, he decided that he wanted to seek a career in medicine. With the financial support of his parents, he studied at the University of Bombay, where he qualified as a Bachelor of Medicine in 1922. The following year, he qualified as a Bachelor of Surgery. After completing his studies, he obtained a position at Bombay Hospital, where he specialised in medicine and gynecology. On the 29th of October 1923, Hakim was commissioned into the Indian Army Medical Service as a medical officer and was posted to Iraq before resigning his commission in October 1926. In May 1925, he married a Parsi woman named Motabai Gardali. The marriage was an arranged one, which eventually turned out to be short-lived. When Hakim emigrated to Britain the following year, he concealed all evidence that he had ever been married. With some financial help from his family, he relocated to Britain in 1926. He attended medical courses at London's University College Hospital under the name Gabriel Hakim, before eventually moving to Edinburgh in 1927 to begin studies towards obtaining a fellowship at the Royal College of Surgeons. The General Medical Council authorised him to practice medicine in the United Kingdom on the strength of the qualifications he had earlier obtained in Bombay. Shortly after, he legally changed his name via deed poll to Buck Ruxton. While studying in Edinburgh, he met a 26-year-old woman named Isabella Van S., who ran a cafe in the city. She was at the time still legally married to a Dutchman, whom she had married in 1919, but this marriage had only lasted a matter of weeks, and she had reverted to using her maiden name of Kerr. The two began a relationship, and Isabella was with Ruxton when he moved south to England in 1928. He worked as a locum to a London doctor, a fellow Parsi named Manik Motofram, and later as an assistant to a Stepney-based doctor named Reigate. The following year, Isabella gave birth to the couple's first child, a daughter they named Elizabeth. In 1930, the Ruxtons decided to move to Lancaster, where he was able to establish a medical practice at the family home at 2 Dalton Square. He had made great efforts to assimilate himself into British society, and he quickly acquired a reputation among his patients as a diligent and compassionate doctor who was well respected and popular within the community. He is known to have waived the treatment fees on several occasions when he felt his patients could not afford to pay them. The following year, a second daughter, Diane, was born, and 2 years later, in 1933, Isabella gave birth to a son named William. The family employed a maid and live-in housekeeper named Mary Rodderson, mainly to help to care for their growing family. But behind closed doors, things were not all as they seemed. The relationship between Buck and Isabella was at times quite fraught, and he became increasingly suspicious of her alleged infidelity. At times, he burst into fits of rage and bouts of tearful hysteria and self-pity. On several occasions, These arguments would prompt Isabella to pack her belongings and return to Edinburgh with her children, although subsequent telephone calls from Ruxton, in which he would plead with Isabella to return to Lancaster, would prompt her to return. It is unknown just when or why Ruxton began to accuse Isabella of adultery and start to assault her, although loud quarrels between the couple had resulted in the police being called on several occasions. The disputes between them occasionally had to be settled at the local police station. It was known that Isabella had attempted suicide in 1932, which had resulted in her suffering a miscarriage. On one occasion, she had complained to the police that her husband had begun beating her. When police visited Ruxton's practice to investigate her claims, he denied he had assaulted his wife, alleging that she had been unfaithful to him. Despite this, within 24 hours of this incident, Isabella had returned to her husband. On another occasion in April 1934, a Lancaster policeman had been called to the Ruxton household following another quarrel. When he arrived at the house, the officer was informed by Ruxton, "Sergeant, I feel like murdering 2 people. My wife is going out to meet a man." In early September 1935, Isabella travelled to Edinburgh to visit one of her sisters. Travelling with her was the prominent Lancaster family named Edmondson, with whom the Ruxtons were well acquainted. Due to the needs of his practice, Ruxton himself did not go with his wife on this trip. He would later say that he had been convinced that Isabella had been seen a number of times with a young man named Robert Edmondson, who worked at the local town hall, and that she had been conducting an affair with him, and the trip had been used as a means for the pair to continue their liaison. Hotel records would later confirm each adult had booked into separate rooms while they had stayed in Edinburgh. On the evening of Saturday the 14th of September, Isabella left the family home to visit the Blackpool illuminations and visit 2 of her sisters, who both lived near Blackpool. She returned home to Dalton Square at around 11:30 p.m. In the early hours of Sunday, Ruxton's jealousy and paranoia completely overwhelmed him, and he most likely strangled Isabella into subconsciousness before beating and stabbing her body. Either to prevent their housemaid from discovering his crime, or because she had actually witnessed what was happening, Ruxton brutally hit the maid, Mary Rogerson, over the head before finally stabbing her. The amount of blood subsequently discovered on the stairs, walls and carpeting of the household indicates excessive violence prior to the bodies being mutilated, which leads to the conclusion that Ruxton had stabbed either or both of his victims shortly before or after their deaths. On the day prior to the murders, Ruxton had told one of the 2 cleaning women he and Isabella employed not to come to the house until Tuesday. Within hours of the murders, he had visited the home of the other cleaner he employed, and also told her not to come round, explaining that Isabella had travelled to Edinburgh. After he had driven his children to the home of some friends, asking them to look after them for the day, he calmly returned to the house, where he proceeded to dismember and mutilate both of the bodies in the bathroom in an effort to hide their identities. Several hours later, at approximately 4:30 p.m, Ruxton visited the home of one of his patients, a Mrs. Hampshire, and asked both her and her husband to return to Dalton Square with him to help him prepare for the decorators, who were expected to arrive the following morning to perform work he claimed had been arranged several months previously. When Mrs. Hampshire arrived at Dalton Square, she found the house in a state of disarray. As she would later testify at Ruxton's trial, All the carpeting had been removed from the stairs, and several sections of the flooring were littered with straw, which also protruded from beneath a locked bedroom door. In the waiting room, she discovered several rolled-up sections of carpeting and a stained suit. In the garden, she also spotted 2 further sections of carpet and several burned towels. On the morning of the 29th of September, a woman called Susan Johnson looked over the parapet of an old stone bridge located 2 miles north of the Dumfriesshire town of Moffat. On the banks of the river called the Garden Home Lynn, she saw a bundle wrapped in fabric that had lodged against a boulder, with a partially decomposed human arm protruding from it. Police were immediately called to the scene, where they discovered the gruesome remains. An extensive search was made of the area and the nearby River Annan, where they discovered 2 human heads and 4 further bundles, each containing extensively mutilated human remains, including thigh bones, legs, sections of flesh, and a human torso and pelvis. These human remains were in an advanced state of decomposition and had been wrapped in bedsheets, a pillowcase, and several newspapers dating from early August 1935. On the 1st of October, the remains were examined at Moffat Mortuary by a forensic scientist, where it was determined that the 70 separate pieces of human remnants discovered were those of 2 females of notably different heights and ages, and that the mutilations had been committed by an individual with extensive anatomical knowledge in an obvious effort to complicate the identification of the victims. In addition to the extensive mutilations, it was felt that it had been entirely done with a surgical knife as opposed to either a saw or an axe. The murderer had removed the eyes, ears, skin, lips, soft tissue, and several teeth from both heads to make identification virtually impossible, with additional attention being devoted to areas of the body where possible distinguishing features such as operational scars or marks may have been visible. The perpetrator had also removed the fingertips from the sole set of hands initially discovered, and had completely sliced all the flesh from the legs of one victim and from the thighs of the other. It was also noted that had the perpetrator actually thrown the remains into the nearby River Annan, as opposed to the tributary river, which had been swollen with heavy rains at the time, the bundles would likely have flowed into the Solway Firth and out to sea, thus delaying or permanently preventing their discovery. Given the proximity of the river to such a major main road, detectives from Glasgow CID, who had already established the remains were unlikely to be those of local individuals, began to consider the possibility the perpetrator had travelled to the area to dispose of the remains and may not have been very familiar with the locality. The body parts were transported to the anatomy department of the University of Edinburgh before being reconstructed prior to formal autopsies. A further bundle containing human remains was discovered shortly after the 2 bodies had been transported to the university. This bundle contained 2 human forearms with hands attached. The fingerprints had not been completely obliterated, and as such, investigators were able to obtain a complete set of fingerprints. As to the approximate time of death, Dumfriesshire police came to the conclusion that suggested the victims' bodies could not have been disposed of in the location where they were found after the 17th of September. The pathologist was able to determine that one of the bodies was that of a woman aged between 35 and 45, and that the second body was that of a woman aged between 20 and 21 at the time of her murder. As to the cause of death, The older woman had 5 stab wounds to the chest, several broken bones, and numerous bruises. In addition, a bone in her neck had been broken, indicating she had been strangled before the other injuries were inflicted. The limbs and head of the second victim bore signs of excessive blunt force trauma, indicating she had been extensively bludgeoned with an unknown instrument. It was further concluded that the mutilation of the 2 bodies would have taken approximately 8 hours to complete. Several of the pages of the Sunday Graphic in which the remains had been wrapped had been printed and circulated solely in the Morecambe and Lancaster area of England on the 15th of September, strongly suggesting the 2 victims and or their murderer lived in the northwest of England. The police focused their efforts on recent missing persons reports filed within this region, on or shortly after the 15th. The fact several sections of the victims' remains had been discovered several hundred yards downstream on the banks of the Garden Home and the River Annan suggested a date on or prior to the 19th of September, when the remains had been thrown into the water. That had been the final date of heavy rainfall in the area, and when the flow of water had been much greater than at the time of the victims' discovery. 5 days before the discovery of the bodies, Ruxton had visited Lancaster police, claiming his wife had once again deserted him. He had earlier visited the Morecambe household of the parents of the family maid, Mary Rogerson, claiming their daughter, having recently engaged in an affair with a local youth, had become pregnant, and that his wife had agreed to discreetly take her away from their home to arrange an abortion. As abortions were at the time illegal in Britain, Ruxton urged the Rogersons not to contact the police. On the 1st of October, the Rogersons visited Ruxton at his practice. He attempted to placate their fears for Mary's safety by claiming both she and his wife had broken into his safe and stolen £30 before leaving. Despite Ruxton's insistence on this occasion that his wife and Mary would almost certainly return once he had spent the money, the fact that he had now given the Rogersons contrary explanations as to why his wife and their daughter were missing from his household aroused their suspicions. The following day, they filed a missing persons report with Morecambe police. Ruxton himself would not visit Lancaster police to formally report his wife and maid as missing until the 4th of October. A short time after, Scottish police visited the Rogerson household and asked Mary's parents if they were able to identify any sections of clothing in which the bodies had been wrapped. Mrs. Rogerson immediately recognised the blouse with a distinct patchwork repair as having belonged to her daughter, who they had last seen on Saturday the 14th of September. The police discovered that Mary's employer, Ruxton, had informally reported his wife missing the previous month, and that the final confirmed sightings of Isabella alive by anyone other than Ruxton himself had been on the evening of the 14th of September, when she had left her 2 sisters in Blackpool to return to her Lancaster home. The same day that police identified several items of the clothing used to wrap the dismembered remains, Ruxton again visited the Lancaster police station. He burst into tears, complained that local rumours had begun to circulate regarding the discoveries of human remains in Scotland as being those of his wife and maid, and that these rumours were proving to be detrimental to both his medical practice and his general reputation. He then requested they conduct discreet inquiries to locate his wife and maid. Although he was placated by officers before being driven home, he was considered the prime suspect in the murders. Lancaster police had by this stage spoken to one of the Ruxton's 2 cleaning ladies, Agnes Oxley, who confirmed to officers that on the 15th, Ruxton had arrived at her home and informed her it was unnecessary for her to work at the premises until the following Tuesday, and that when she arrived at work, the house had been in a general state of shambles, with carpets removed, a pile of burned fabric-like material in the garden, and the bath extensively stained with a yellowish discoloration. Ruxton had specifically requested she clean the bath that day. Speaking to the neighbours, the police also discovered that Ruxton had asked Mrs. Hampshire and her husband to extensively clean his house in preparation for redecoration. On the evening of the 12th of October, Ruxton was arrested by Lancaster police and questioned throughout the night. When asked to account for his whereabouts between the 14th and the 29th of September, Ruxton produced a handwritten document entitled My Movements, which he then passed to investigators before making a voluntary statement based on what he had written. In this interview, Ruxton denied he had ever been to Scotland after having established his Lancaster practice, but he was unable to explain just why his car registration number had been logged by a cyclist who had knocked over in Kendal in Cumbria on the 17th of September, which had led to his vehicle being pulled over by the police in nearby Milnthorpe the same day. The cyclist had reported his registration number when he had failed to stop at the scene of the accident. Lancaster police suggested to Ruxton this incident was strong circumstantial evidence as the events had occurred as he had been driving to Lancaster from Moffat, which he denied. He was further unable to explain just why a police search of his home the previous day had revealed extensive traces of bloodstains on the stairs, railings, balustrade, and various carpets within the property, despite evidence of the house being extensively cleaned, and several walls around the staircase being recently redecorated. Moreover, he was also unable to explain why traces of human fat and body tissue had been discovered within the drains of the property, with much of this material recovered within the section of the drains leading directly from the bathroom. Throughout the several hours of questioning, Lancaster police repeatedly conversed with their Scottish counterparts. The finger and palm prints of the second set of human hands discovered were found to be a match for prints on items Mary Rogerson had habitually handled at Dalton Square. On hearing of this forensic match, Ruxton was formally charged with the murder of Mary. Following an appearance in Lancaster Police Court, situated on the ground floor of the town hall, Ruxton was remanded in custody. In November, he was further charged with the murder of his wife, whose remains were positively identified using the technique of forensic anthropology, in which an X-ray of a victim's skull was superimposed on a photograph taken of Isabella Ruxton while she was alive. Professor James Brash would later construct replica models of the two victims' left feet. When placed in shoes the woman had worn, the replica foot of the first victim recovered from the vicinity of the River Annan precisely fitted a shoe worn by Mary Rogerson, and the replica foot of the second victim recovered precisely fitted shoes worn by Isabella Ruxton. In March 1936, the trial of Ruxton opened at Manchester High Court and lasted 11 days. He was tried for the murder of his wife and chose to enter a formal plea of not guilty to the charge. The prosecution case stated that the accused, inflamed by jealousy and paranoia, had murdered Isabella and Mary Rogerson in the family home, and that he had then discarded their bodies more than 100 miles from Lancaster, in the river in southern Scotland. Ruxton's defence counsel based their case on the fact that the bodies had been misidentified and that they were not those of Isabella Ruxton and Mary Rogerson, but of two other unknown individuals, and that the evidence presented to the jury was flawed. Despite the defence counsel subjecting the numerous eyewitnesses and the medical and forensic experts whom the prosecution introduced to intense cross-examination in an effort to challenge their findings, they remained steadfast as to the conclusions regarding the identification of the victims, and that their murders had been committed by Ruxton at 2 Dalton Square. The sole witness to testify on behalf of the defence was Ruxton himself, who conducted himself poorly on the stand, being prone to bouts of hysterical sobbing as he clutched a silk handkerchief, and hysterically claiming that he had last seen his wife when she had taken Mary Rogerson to Edinburgh to discreetly arrange an abortion for her. He readily admitted to having frequently argued with his wife over her alleged infidelity, and justified the mental and physical hardships to which he had occasionally subjected her. Despite this admission, he was insistent that both women would be found alive, and further stated that if the actual identification of the bodies was correct, his happy home was now in tatters. He ardently denied the earlier testimony of various prosecution witnesses, whom he frequently accused of either lying or simply being mistaken, and frequently gave rambling, contradictory accounts of his own behaviour and actions prior to his arrest, when questioned by both his own defence counsel and by the prosecution. The majority of the evidence came from eyewitnesses and from medical and forensic experts who testified on behalf of the prosecution. Outlining the inconsistencies in the accounts Ruxton had given to people as to the whereabouts of his wife and maid, the jury were aware of accounts delivered by numerous individuals who had earlier testified, before turning to Ruxton's exhaustive efforts to destroy evidence and pacify Mary Rogerson's parents as to their daughter's whereabouts in the weeks between the murders and his arrest. As to the motive for the murders, it was suggested the jury look no further than Ruxton's obsessive jealousy and violent temper. The defence's case was that, although the victims were indeed 2 women who had been murdered, the remains were not those of Isabella Ruxton and Mary Rogerson, as the Crown had alleged, and that the idea that the motive for Isabella's death had been Ruxton's suspicions of his wife's infidelity was merely conjecture. It was further emphasised that although some of the testimony delivered had allowed the possibility the bodies may have been those of Ruxton's wife and family maid, that these conclusions had been drawn in part from circumstantial evidence, and that this evidence still did not prove Ruxton had been the actual murderer. Following the closing arguments and Judge Singleton's final instructions, the jury retired to consider their decision. They would deliberate for just over 1 hour before returning a verdict of guilty. Consequently, the judge sentenced Ruxton to death. When asked if he had anything to say in response to the verdict and sentence, the accused responded, "I am very sorry," before politely thanking the court for its patience and the fairness of the trial. Ruxton then informed the judge of his intentions to appeal the verdict. He did file an appeal against his conviction on the basis of the judge's final instructions delivered to the jury were misdirected. The appeal also stated that a forensic examination of his car, said by the prosecution to have been the vehicle used to transport the bodies, had revealed no traces of either mud or blood. Ruxton therefore thought that the cumulative effect of all matters raised were tantamount to a substantial misdirection. The appeal was heard on the 27th of April and was dismissed as being insufficient as to even remotely suggesting any form of misdirection on the part of the judge at the trial. Despite a petition from Lancaster residents urging clemency, having collected over 10,000 signatures, Ruxton was hanged at Manchester Prison on the morning of the 12th of May 1936. His executioner was the renowned Albert Pierpoint. The day after the execution, a Sunday newspaper published a brief handwritten confession written by Ruxton the day after his arrest, and which he had instructed to be opened only in the event of his death or returned to him should he be acquitted. In this confession, Ruxton admitted to killing his wife while in a state of jealous fury, only to be interrupted in the act by Mary Rogerson, as a result of which he had to also kill her. Despite intense police searches, the torso of Mary Rogerson was never found, having likely been washed out into the Solway Firth. The remains of her body actually recovered were buried in a churchyard in the village of Overton. The house on Dalton Square where the murders were committed would remain empty for decades. In the 1980s, the building underwent substantial internal renovation, particularly the bathroom, and the building would become offices. The bath in which Ruxton dismembered his two victims was removed from the property to be used as evidence during his trial. It was later used as a horse trough by the Mounted Police Division at Lancashire County Police Headquarters. The children, Elizabeth, Diane and William Ruxton, are believed to have been brought up in an orphanage in the Wirral.